Hey everyone, here is a follow-up video to my Universal Arcade Stick Grip Guide. In that video I go over the physical details of how I think proper arcade stick grip looks, or at least a method of proper arcade stick grip, and sort of physically handling the arcade lever and all that good stuff. But in this video I want to talk a little bit more on the macro side of things as far as transitioning from pad or transitioning from keyboard to arcade stick. I think a lot of people who have a desire to play arcade stick, or maybe even own their arcade stick, have had it for months or years, but can't really bring themselves to fully embrace it, and instead find themselves continually going back to their pad or continually going back to their keyboard. In this video I want to kind of break down, I think, the overall process of becoming an arcade stick player mostly, and sort of making that switch to fully playing arcade stick and feeling like it is your best input method rather than sort of a secondary input method. I remember this very clearly when I first transitioned to arcade stick. I was playing Street Fighter 4 online a lot at the time, and what I would do is I'd start playing on arcade stick and find that I wasn't playing as well. So like in round 1 I'd lose, and then I'd switch over to pad in round 2 and 3 and try and win with pad. And so I kept doing this over and over. And also whenever I was playing games that were more technical, I found myself returning to pad more often. But I think what helped me transition to being a full arcade stick player, and actually feeling like arcade stick now is by far my strongest input method, is this sort of guideline that I'm going to outline in this video. So the first thing I want you to kind of think about and understand is that arcade stick is, I think you've heard this many times before, but I think it is true, arcade stick is sort of like playing a musical instrument, or it's sort of like picking up a new skill in sports or something like that. And so the first thing you need to, or maybe for instance learning a new grip in tennis, right? Like you're going from a one-handed backhand to a two-handed backhand. This is probably very sportsy, but anyway, when it comes to learning arcade stick, the first thing you need to realize right away is that you are not going to be that skilled on the arcade stick at first. It's just because the muscles need to build up their neural paths and all that sort of, biological stuff. There needs to be a process of transition within your brain, where your brain is starting to make the connections between the movements of your hand and its instant reflexes. That's why you're so much better on your pad, or that's why you're so much better on your keyboard, is because your brain has already forged those connections, and so it knows how to quickly and effectively input things based on your actions without having to do that middle step of, oh shit, there's a bullet flying at me. Okay, let's move this set of muscles to the left to avoid this bullet. And that's what it's going to do when you're first playing arcade stick. Basically, when you're first learning arcade stick, there's an extra mental step that your brain needs to go through in order to execute the inputs that aren't there for the input method that you use normally, like pad or like keyboard. And so the way it works, and again this is with many things in life, the way it works is that you need to train that middle step over and over through exposure and through practice, to the point where that middle step disappears, and so your brain instantly knows, oh, a bullet's coming at me, let's move this hand to the left now, without having to think about it. And so I'm going to kind of give you my guidelines of how to make this a more seamless transition, because of course one method is just go cold turkey, throw your pad away. I don't know if you can throw your keyboard away, but lock down your keyboard and just play an arcade stick, ride or die until you get used to it. That is a method of doing it, but I think a lot of people find that really frustrating, and I can understand that. I personally didn't do this as well. And so one thing that I think could be really, really helpful is actually taking a step back, because when it comes to playing arcade stick, most people are picking up arcade stick for specific genres like shmups or fighting games that have actually very intense input requirements and are more demanding of you than the games that you play casually on pad, right? Like Super Mario Bros, Donkey Kong Country, all that stuff. And so I think the first step is actually, yes, use training mode and like practice the inputs, practice the motions that you want to do. In shmups, go ahead and play credits and try and execute the things you want to do. But when you find you're getting frustrated, you find the inputs aren't working well for you, you're finding that you're not playing as well as you do on the other input methods, my first recommendation is actually to start playing games that you are very comfortable with and that are actually less demanding of you than playing something like a fighting game where you're trying to do double quarter supers and stuff like that. And the reason for this is you want to acclimatize your brain to using this input method. And so my first recommendation is start playing some simpler games with your arcade stick. Go back and play Super Mario Bros. Go back and play Mega Man X or a Mega Man game. Go back and play Donkey Kong Country. Or even if you want to go real slow, play like a RPG like Pokemon, or play an RPG like Super Mario RPG or something. But you just need to start putting time into other games that aren't necessarily as high intensity as something like a fighting game or something like a shmup, because that way your brain is still making those connections, is still forging those paths, is still realizing this hand movement is left, this hand movement is right, this hand movement is pressing Y, this hand movement is pressing B, or whatever it is. And so that's actually a really good way to start transitioning from playing on pad or keyboard to playing arcade stick. So for me, I did this with Super Metroid, which is actually a little bit challenging but totally possible. I started playing Super Metroid on arcade stick, and this actually helped me learn the arcade stick. Same thing with Donkey Kong Country, Super Mario Bros. These types of games. Platformers especially are really good, because most platformers are just left and right. You have with your occasional down inputs and timing your button presses. And so even though it's a little bit of a transition, it's not nearly as demanding as something like a fighting game where you're having to do Dragon Punch inputs or double quarter inputs or Korean backdash, right? Like a lot of people who pick up stick for Tekken, that's a real rough transition, because you're going to a new input method that you haven't built any sort of, mental pathways for your hands and things like that. And you're immediately going into some of the most difficult inputs that are available to you in fighting games, right? Like the Korean backdash, the wave dash, the electric, all that sort of stuff. These types of inputs are actually very, very challenging. It would be sort of the equivalent to picking up the piano, immediately trying to play some very technical, Mozart or something. I don't know how technical I don't know piano, but trying to play some very technical musical pieces on the piano rather than picking up the piano and learning Mary Had a Little Lamb or some of the more simple songs, right? And so that's kind of how it works with the arcade stick as well. Or a way to think about it is you should probably begin by spending time lower intensity, either drop down the difficulty of your shmups, maybe play some easier shmups in fighting games, maybe just focus on playing and doing the more basic inputs first before you start trying to work on your Korean backdash and your electric, just to get those, again, that sort of second nature built up. And then when you start to get to there, that's when you can kind of transition into the more difficult inputs more comfortably. Of course, I'm not saying that you have to do this exactly that way. I mean, you could pick up your arcade stick and work on doing electrics and work on your Korean backdash, but I'm just saying is that you also need to think about learning the fundamentals as well, rather than just trying to shortcut to the most difficult ways of playing these games. And I think that's where a lot of people run into this problem with arcade stick, is the pad isn't as good for certain inputs as the arcade stick. They know this, they've seen this, so they get the arcade stick, but they're finding, oh wow, I can actually do the inputs way better on pad than I can on arcade stick. Not only that, but my overall gameplay is just way better on pad. This whole arcade stick thing, it's overhyped, I guess, or it doesn't work for me. When really, again, you're just trying to shortcut the entire process of learning the input method to the most difficult technical parts of, playing these games. And so for the rest of this video, I'm just going to show kind of some demos of games that I played and things that I do that I think helped increase my skills in the arcade stick overall. Another bit of advice I have for shmup players specifically is maybe pick up some games where you do a lot of grazing, like Don Makum Limited 3 or Toho games, something like that. Because grazing games really do help you build up your fundamental control of your ship, because they constantly force you to be more technical with your inputs as far as being close to bullets and grazing them and stuff like that. So that's another bit of advice where I think if you're transitioning from keyboard or transitioning from pad to arcade stick and you're for shmups and you're looking kind of for a good shmup to make that transition a little bit more quick or a little bit more natural, I think playing a shmup that involves grazing, again like Touhou or Danmaku Unlimited 3 or something like that, is going to help you sort of work on that control a little more than something like a cave game or those types of things. So yeah, I'd like to end this video by thanking my patrons, and hopefully this has been useful, and I'll also play some footage here of me playing, games that I recommend returning to, games that I think are kind of a good introductory to playing stick before going full in on something like Tekken or a lot of these more technical like cave shmups and stuff like that. So thank you to Dingo, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Brian Shiver, Dunpeel 2064, EC 2151, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Gus, Kiwi, Jake Ryan, Joe Angelo, John, Gameboy Guru, K, Quentin, Malaise, Mark Sloan, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Daggers, Okla Kugels, Parlar, Rhizosis, Sarah Thumbs, Scentmore App, Smacky Factor, Sugumo, Turapon, Plasmo, Young Money Sweet, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.